In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1811, the middle of the United States tore itself apart. Along the Mississippi River, near a small frontier town called New Madrid, Missouri, the ground heaved and rolled in visible waves like the surface of the sea. The mighty Mississippi churned and thrashed, and then, for a few impossible hours, it appeared to run backwards. Its waters rushing upstream over new waterfalls that had not existed the day before. Whole islands vanished beneath the river. Forests toppled. The earth cracked open in long fissures that ran for miles. And more than 1,000 miles away, in the city of Boston, the shaking rolled in strong enough to set church bells ringing all on their own, in the dead of night, with no hand to pull them. This was only the first of a series of colossal earthquakes that would hammer the American heartland over the following 3 months, some of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on the North American continent. And here is the part that almost no one realizes today. It did not happen in California. It happened in the quiet, flat farm country of the Mississippi Valley, in a place that no one, then or now, thinks of as earthquake country at all. This is the story of the New Madrid Seismic Zone, America's forgotten fault, why it is far more dangerous than its obscurity would ever suggest, and what would happen if the ground in the very middle of the country were ever to break like that again. Let me be clear and honest right at the very start, because this is a story about risk and not a prediction. I am not here to tell you that an earthquake is about to strike the Midwest tomorrow, or next year, or on any date that anyone can name. What I am going to walk you through is something real, well-documented, and genuinely underappreciated, a fault system. Buried deep beneath the middle of the country that has produced catastrophic earthquakes before, that is still quietly active today, and that sits, this time around, directly beneath the homes of millions of people who are almost entirely unprepared for it. This is not a countdown. It is a warning about a sleeping giant that most of the country has simply forgotten is even there. So let me take you back to what actually happened, because the reality of it is difficult to fully absorb. The Great Convulsion of 1811 and 1812 was not one earthquake, but a sequence of them. There were 3 enormous main shocks. The first struck in the small hours of December 16, 1811. The second came weeks later, on the morning of January 23, 1812. And the third and largest of all struck on February 7, 1812, and it was this one that finally destroyed the town of New Madrid itself. The best modern estimates from the United States Geological Survey put these 3 earthquakes at around magnitude 7.5 to 7.7, with some historical estimates ranging even higher, past magnitude 8. To put that in perspective, these were, by a wide margin, the largest earthquakes ever recorded in the entire eastern 2/3 of North America, considerably more powerful than the famous earthquake that would later devastate San Francisco in 1906. And the effects were almost beyond belief. The shaking was felt across roughly half of the continent, from Quebec in the north down to New Orleans in the south, and from the Atlantic coast all the way out toward the Rocky Mountains. In Boston, more than 1,000 miles from the epicenter, the tremors rang church bells. In Cincinnati and in St. Louis, chimneys cracked and toppled. Near the fault itself, eyewitnesses described the ground moving in visible waves. The earth rising and falling like swells on the ocean. Great fissures split open across the landscape. Geysers of sand and water erupted up out of the ground as the shaking liquefied the wet soil beneath. Vast tracts of forest, an area estimated at around 150,000 acres, were destroyed, the trees snapped or swallowed. Lakes that had existed for centuries drained away in an instant, and entirely new lakes were born. The largest of them, Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, was created when a huge section of ground dropped, and the river water rushed in to fill it, and it is still there today, a permanent scar on the map left by those few violent minutes. And then there is the single most famous and most astonishing detail of all: the Mississippi River ran backwards. It is the only such event ever documented in the river's history. Now, the river did not literally flow uphill, of course. What happened was a combination of things. All at once, massive underwater landslides displaced enormous volumes of water. The river channel itself buckled and shifted, and the land in places was thrust suddenly upward, creating temporary waterfalls and rapids where the river had run smooth the day before. Eyewitnesses on the water reported seeing the great river seem to stand completely still and then turn and rush furiously back upstream for several hours, carrying boats along with it. For a time, in the heart of the continent, one of the largest rivers in the world simply reversed its course. And it is worth remembering that this was not over in a single terrible night. The great shocks of December, January, and February were only the peaks of a catastrophe that ground on for months. In between and after them came hundreds upon hundreds of aftershocks. Some of them themselves powerful earthquakes, strong enough to topple whatever the main shocks had left standing. For weeks on end, the ground beneath the frontier settlers simply would not be still. Through the bitter cold of that winter, terrified families abandoned their cabins altogether and camped out in the open air, unwilling to sleep beneath a roof that might come down on them in the dark. The tremors rolled on, day after day, week after week, well into the following year, and were still being felt, faintly, 2 years later. It was not a single blow, but a long, grinding season of terror, in which the very earth itself seemed to have turned unreliable, and no one knew when or whether it would finally stop. And yet, and this is the crucial part, for all of that unimaginable violence, the earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 killed almost no one. As far as the historical records show, only 1 or 2 people are known to have died. How on earth is that possible for earthquakes of this staggering size? The answer is simple, and it is the single most important thing you need to understand about the danger that exists today. In 1811, the central Mississippi Valley was near empty frontier. The town of New Madrid itself had only about 400 residents, and the handful of people scattered across that wilderness mostly lived in log cabins and tents, structures that, as it happens, are remarkably good at surviving an earthquake because they flex and sway and settle instead of shattering. There were no cities out there, no skyscrapers, no brick apartment blocks, no hospitals, no bridges, no highways, no fuel pipelines, no dams. The earth unleashed one of the single greatest convulsions in the entire history of the continent, and there was almost nothing standing in its path for it to destroy. That and that alone is the reason 1811 became a geological curiosity in the history books, rather than one of the deadliest disasters in American history. And that is precisely the thing that is now completely changed. Because today, that very same fault zone does not run beneath empty frontier. It runs directly beneath the homes of roughly 15 million people. The region that stood all but deserted in 1811 is now studded with major cities. Memphis, Tennessee, with a metropolitan population of well over 1 million, sits practically on top of the southern end of the seismic zone. St. Louis, Missouri, with nearly 3 million people across its metro area, anchors the northern end. Little Rock, Nashville, Louisville, Evansville, Paducah, all of them lie well within the reach of serious, damaging shaking. Where there were once log cabins, there now stand high-rise towers, hospitals full of patients, schools full of children, and countless century-old buildings of brick and stone. Where there was open, empty river, there are now enormous bridges carrying interstate highways and freight railroads across the Mississippi. And threaded all through the region run the pipelines, the power lines, and the shipping lanes that the entire country quietly depends upon. The stage that stood empty in 1811 is now absolutely crowded with everything that a modern civilization has spent 2 centuries building. And now we come to the part that makes this threat genuinely, fundamentally different from the earthquakes that most Americans actually think about, the ones out in California. And it comes down, of all things, to the very rock beneath our feet. The crust of the western United States, out around California, is geologically young, broken, and heavily fractured. It is riddled through with faults and cracks and fault lines. And it turns out that broken, fractured rock is actually rather good at one particular thing: it absorbs the energy of an earthquake. The seismic waves travel outward from the source, and they run headlong into all of those countless cracks and breaks, and they lose their strength comparatively quickly. Which is why even a very large California earthquake tends to concentrate its worst destruction within a relatively contained area. But the rock beneath the central United States is the complete and total opposite. It is ancient, cold, hard, and remarkably solid and intact. A vast, largely unbroken slab of old continental bedrock, hundreds of millions of years in the making. And solid, unbroken rock transmits the energy of an earthquake with genuinely terrifying efficiency, like a great struck bell that rings on and on and on. The seismic waves roll outward across the stable, solid interior of the continent with very little to stop them or slow them down, and they carry violent, destructive shaking many times farther than the very same earthquake ever would in the fractured West. This is the precise reason that back in 1811, those earthquakes were felt across more than 30 states and rang church bells 1,000 miles away in Boston. A New Madrid earthquake does not simply strike a single city and stop. It reaches out and grips an enormous swath of the nation's heartland all at once. The very same magnitude of earthquake that might rattle one region in California could hammer a full dozen states across the American Midwest. And there is a second, more local twist that makes the danger worse still. The city of Memphis, along with much of the surrounding river valley, sits atop soft, deep sediments, mud, silt, and sand laid down by the Mississippi River over millions of years. And soft ground does to an earthquake's seismic waves almost exactly what a bowl of jelly does when you wrap your knuckles on the table beneath it. It shakes harder, and it shakes for longer than solid rock ever would. So the very same fertile river valley that made the region such rich and productive farmland also, cruelly, makes its cities dangerously prone to amplified, prolonged, and violent shaking. So why is there a major active fault buried right in the middle of a continent at all, so very far from the edges of the tectonic plates, out where earthquakes are actually supposed to happen? The honest answer is that scientists do not entirely understand it, but the leading theory is a genuinely haunting one. Around 500 million years ago, the ancient landmass that would eventually become North America very nearly tore itself in two, right here in this exact spot. A great rift began to open, the continent starting to pull apart and split, the way that continents sometimes do over the vast spans of geologic time. And then, for reasons now lost to deep time, it stopped. The rift failed. But it left behind a deep, buried scar, an entire zone of ancient, weakened, broken faults, hidden away far beneath the flat farmland and the thick river sediments. And every so often, as the whole of the North American plate is slowly and relentlessly squeezed by titanic forces acting on it from thousands of miles away, that old buried scar shifts, and it slips, and the ground shakes. The threat, in other words, is a 500 million year old wound in the continent that never fully healed. So how likely is all of this to actually happen again? And here, honesty genuinely matters, because the real answer has two very distinct sides to it. On the one hand, a full repeat of the great 1811 and 1812 sequence, a magnitude 7.5 or greater monster, is not especially likely within any given human lifetime. Scientists put the probability of a repeat on that catastrophic scale at somewhere around 7 to 10% over the course of the next 50 years. That is a real and non-trivial risk, but it is very far from a coin flip. On the other hand, the odds of a still serious, genuinely damaging earthquake, a magnitude 6 or larger, are considerably higher, somewhere between 25 and 40% over that same 50-year window. And while a magnitude 6 might sound almost modest set beside the giants of 1811, if it were to strike directly beneath a large, unprepared, modern city, it could still inflict tremendous damage and cost many lives. And there is one more genuinely sobering fact buried in the geologic record. When scientists dig carefully down into the ancient layers of soil and sediment here, reading the old scars of liquefaction and upheaval, they find that the New Madrid Zone has produced sequences of major earthquakes over and over and over again across the past several thousand years. This is emphatically not some one-time freak accident of history. It is a recurring event. The fault is not dead. It is only sleeping. And it is, at this very moment, still ticking away, quietly producing hundreds of tiny, almost entirely unfelt earthquakes every single year. A constant, low murmur from the deep that serves as a steady reminder that the giant beneath the heartland is very much still alive down there. So what would actually happen if it were to strike today? Government scientists and federal emergency planners have modeled precisely this grim scenario, a repeat of that magnitude 7.7 earthquake beneath the modern-day central United States, and the projections that come back are genuinely staggering. In the worst-case scenarios, such an earthquake could cause something on the order of tens of thousands of casualties. By one federal estimate, it could displace more than 7 million people from their homes, and it could inflict close to $300 billion in direct physical damage alone, with the true indirect economic toll to the country potentially running far, far higher than even that. Close to the epicenter, the shaking would be violent enough to level unreinforced buildings entirely, reducing them to rubble. In a city like Memphis, thousands upon thousands of older brick and masonry buildings, structures that were never once designed with an earthquake in mind, could partially or completely collapse. The critical bridges that carry the highways and the railroads across the Mississippi River could fail, cutting entire cities off from the outside world and severing the great transportation arteries of the whole nation in a single stroke. Fuel pipelines that run directly through the heart of the seismic zone could rupture and burn. And because this particular region sits at the absolute crossroads of the country's shipping, energy, and freight networks, the devastation would refuse to stay politely contained in the Midwest. It would ripple outward and disrupt the entire United States for weeks and very likely months on end. FEMA has in fact openly described a major New Madrid earthquake as potentially being America's next great disaster. It is worth dwelling for a moment on why the whole country, and not just the Midwest, would feel the blow, because this region is not merely populated, it is a critical junction of the entire nation's circulatory system. Some of the most important fuel pipelines in the country run straight through or beside the seismic zone. Carrying gasoline and other petroleum products from the refineries of the Gulf Coast up toward the cities of the East and the Northeast, sever those, and fuel shortages could spread hundreds of miles beyond the shaking. The Mississippi River itself is one of the busiest shipping arteries on Earth, its barges hauling a vast share of the nation's grain exports, coal, and raw materials down to the sea, and a wrecked river with collapsed bridges and buckled locks could choke that traffic for months. Major east-west interstates and freight rail lines all funnel across the river through this same narrow corridor. In other words, an earthquake here would not just flatten buildings in Memphis and St. Louis. It could reach into gas tanks, grocery stores, and supply chains clear across the country, in places that never felt the ground so much as tremble. And the deepest, hardest problem underlying every bit of this is the very one we started with. Unlike California, where decades of strict, hard-won building codes have quietly and steadily earthquake-proofed the cities. Brick by brick and beam by beam, the central United States built itself up almost entirely without a single thought given to earthquakes. The buildings, the bridges, the pipelines, the schools, the hospitals, the overwhelming majority of them were never designed to withstand the kind of shaking that this fault is fully capable of producing. An entire region that had simply forgotten it lives in earthquake country went ahead and built itself as though the ground would always, obligingly, hold perfectly still. So let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and with real balance, because a subject this heavy demands clear eyes far more than it demands raw fear. Let me be as clear as I possibly can about what this is not. It is not a prediction that the Midwest will be struck tomorrow, or next year, or on any specific date that any person alive could ever name for you. The most catastrophic scenario of all, a full 1811 scale event, remains, within any given span of years, relatively unlikely to occur. These are probabilities, and not a ticking countdown clock. And there is genuine, real, encouraging progress being made. Seismologists now monitor the zone very closely with sensitive instruments. Building codes across the region have slowly begun to account for the threat, and emergency planners in all of those states now run drills and quietly prepare for exactly this kind of event. Awareness, which is, in the end, the first and single most important defense against any disaster, is steadily growing. So this is not ultimately a story of doom. It is the story of a real, well-understood, and genuinely preparable hazard that most of the country has simply allowed itself to forget about entirely, and the whole point of understanding it is not to be afraid, but to be ready. The great tragedy would be to keep right on building and living in the heart of the country as though the earth beneath it will always stay perfectly still, when the rock down there has already shown us, once before, in vivid and terrible detail, exactly what it is capable of doing. So the next time you find yourself picturing an American earthquake, and your mind goes straight, as everyone's does, to California, to the San Andreas Fault, to Los Angeles or San Francisco, I would ask you to remember instead the quiet farm country along the Mississippi River and the small, forgotten town of New Madrid. Remember that the most powerful earthquakes in the entire recorded history of the eastern two-thirds of this continent did not strike the coast at all. They struck the middle. Beneath the calm, flat, endless fields of the American heartland, a 500-million-year-old scar in the bedrock is still down there, still under strain, still locked, still slipping now and again in tiny tremors that not a single soul ever feels. Most days, and most years, and most decades, it sleeps. But it has woken before, and it shook half a continent when it did. And the only real question left, the same question it always, ever is whether, when it finally chooses to stir again, we will have remembered that it was there at all.